well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Welcome to another edition of Bearing Arms, Cam and Company. My name is Cam Edwards. Glad to be with you today before the rain and the wind and the hail starts in Central Virginia. Hopefully our power stays on, but the good news is even if my power goes out, we've got plenty of other folks at bearingarms.com to keep you updated on all of the latest Second Amendment news and information. We're going to be talking about a new survey of Seattle residents that shows drug use, not gun violence, the driving concern for those in Seattle, despite the fact that the state legislature and politicians like Bob Ferguson, the attorney general in Washington state, as well as Governor Jay Inslee, focused far more on cracking down on law-abiding gun owners than either illegal drug use or, frankly, violent crime involving firearms. We'll get to that story in just a second. But before we do, Biden's America is absolutely crushing us. You've got companies laying off tens of thousands of workers, one after the other. America's working two jobs just to get by. Inflation pushing hardworking families to the brink. Hell, just look at the price of lunch meat these days. Was at the store yesterday. I can tell you, it's painful. And a digital dollar could be coming down the pipeline to completely destroy our way of life. The truth is, you need a plan. You know it, and I know it. And that's why you should call Goldco, so you can diversify your savings and investments with gold and silver before things get worse. They're a 6-time Inc. 5000 winner, 2022 Company of the Year with thousands of 5-star reviews, and they've helped people like you and me place over $1 billion in gold and silver. They're offering up to $10,000 in free silver while supplies last, and if you call them today, qualified callers will get a free Ronald Reagan half-ounce silver coin. So don't wait. Call Goldco at 855-412-3806 today. That's 855-412-3806. So let's talk about this survey of Seattle residents. I thought this was fascinating. Drug use, gun violence, top Seattle's public safety concerns, polls find. This specifically a poll done by the local paper there in Seattle. This was from the Seattle Times, survey of about 500 Seattle residents. And it really wasn't even close. I mean, you can take a look here at the numbers of the following four choices. Which is the biggest public safety concern in Seattle? 33% of all respondents said gun violence, compared to 48.4% of respondents who said drug use. 7% said car theft, 6% said shoplifting, another 5% undecided, 0.4% refused to answer that question. So again, drug use, by far the overriding concern for Seattle residents. As the Seattle Times notes, there's also a significant age split in how people answer the question. 58% of respondents 18 to 24 said drug use was their top public safety concern, while 44% of respondents 65 and older picked that answer. Of the respondents who identified gun violence as a top safety concern, 36% were people 65 and older, compared with 15% of 18 to 24-year-olds. I have a theory about this because gun violence, quote unquote, we are told disproportionately impacts younger Americans. So one would think that those younger Americans, in fact, we've been told younger Americans are more supportive of gun control than older generations. I don't buy it. I've seen surveys to the contrary. And this, again, is another indication that among young adults, gun violence is not the overriding concern that the media makes it out to be. So my theory is that this younger cohort, 18 to 24-year-olds, that's the group that is probably less likely to tune in to the nightly news, to, open up a physical newspaper, or even go online to the Seattle Times and other local news outlets to get their news. There's a mantra in the news industry: if it bleeds, it leads, right? And that can leave a false impression on just how bad violent crime can be. Violent crime, crimes involving firearms, are reported far more often in the news media than drug overdose deaths, even though in Seattle there are far more drug overdose deaths than there are shootings of any kind. In fact, according to the Axios Seattle news site, both fatal and non-fatal shootings investigated in Seattle this year, a little bit less than 80, about 72 shootings, including 15 homicides in Seattle. In King County, which is Seattle and, the surrounding suburbs, as of, this was May 15th, the King County Health Department had recorded 524 overdose deaths in the county. Yeah, just through May 15th. That is higher than the entire drug overdose death total in 2020, when the county saw 508 overdose deaths. According to KOMO, King County on pace to exceed last year's record-breaking total of 1,000 overdose deaths. Again, on pace for something around 1,100 overdose deaths. Now, again, these aren't overdoses where Narcan's administered, the person recovers, maybe goes on to overdose again, maybe in rare circumstances gets treatment and gets help. No, these are fatalities. 15 homicides in Seattle through mid-May. And again, 500 drug overdose deaths in Seattle and the surrounding King County during that same time period. So I got to say, I think the residents of Seattle who said that drug use is their primary concern, I think it's valid. I think it is a much bigger issue right now, frankly, than quote-unquote gun violence in Seattle. It just doesn't get nearly the media attention that quote-unquote gun violence gets. What are the other big concerns in Seattle? And this comes not from this survey from the Seattle Times, but from the city of Seattle's public safety survey. One of the, again, big concerns here, a lack of police staffing. According to the Seattle Times, more than 10,300 people who live or work in the city completed the survey. Of those, nearly 3,700 offered narrative comments, from which researchers identified 51 distinct themes. The survey report shows property crime, police capacity, and homelessness are the top three public safety concerns in the city. Property crime and police capacity, i.e. the number of officers available to respond to 911 calls, have consistently remained top safety concerns since the survey's inception. Now, again, this isn't something that the media brings up a lot in Seattle. Not these days. Maybe in 2020, maybe during the CHOP era, or the CHAZ, the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, right? But since then, staffing hasn't really gotten any better in Seattle. The department is still understaffed by hundreds of officers, and that still is a driving concern of residents, even if it's not a driving concern of the media, and certainly not much of a concern for Seattle's politicians or the Democrats in charge of the state government in Olympia. Now, again, what are they doing this year? Well, let's see. They passed a ban on so-called assault weapons, right? That was the legislature's big ticket item. A gun that is rarely used in crime, is commonly owned by law-abiding Americans all across the state of Washington. That was basically their top legislative priority. Crack down on legal gun owners. Meanwhile, illegal drugs are killing hundreds of Seattle residents. And again, the 500 overdose deaths recorded in King County between January 1st and May 15th of this year, that's one county. That's not the entire state of Washington. There are going to be, I would say at the end of the year, probably 8 to 10 drug overdose deaths in the state of Washington for every homicide, gun-related or not. That is a huge issue. And it's not just an issue that is limited or isolated to Washington state. Baltimore, Maryland, for example, they've been having 300 plus homicides every year for the past 8 years. They're actually on pace. Crime is down, believe it or not, in Baltimore, despite or maybe because of the shall issue laws that are in place now. But the drug overdose death rate in Baltimore, when you had, 330 homicides, you'd have 800, 900 drug overdose deaths. And again, one of those numbers got reported. The other one, it may have gotten reported, but it certainly didn't get covered in the media to the same extent that quote unquote gun violence does. So it is easy to get a false impression just relying on the media, relying on your local news outlets. It's easy to get this false impression that, again, violent crime is completely out of control, that every time you set foot outside of your house because of the weak gun laws across the nation, your life is in danger. But as it turns out, in Seattle and virtually every other major U.S. city, far more people are dying because of illegal drug overdose deaths than because of law-abiding gun owners exercising their fundamental right to keep and bear arms. And yet again, what's the bigger issue for the Democrats around the country? You, me, and our right, our fundamental right to armed self-defense. All right, let's turn our attention now to today's armed citizen story, our good deed of the day, and our recidivist report. We will start there with a case out of Chicago. CWB Chicago reporting on a 4-time burglar arrested for burglary just 5 days after getting out of prison. And yes, he did not serve the entirety of his sentence. Ruben Sandoval, according to CWB Chicago, got out of prison last Friday, June 16th, after serving half of a 6-year sentence for burglary. 5 days after he was released from prison, he got trapped in a security gate while trying to burglarize a grocery store on the west side of Chicago. Chicago police freed him from the gate and then arrested him. Sandoval allegedly told the officers, "Well, I haven't broken in yet." So he's been charged with attempted burglary and not burglary itself. According to CWB Chicago, before landing his current 6-year sentence for burglary, Sandoval received 2 3-year sentences for burglary in 2019, received probation for burglary in 2015. He also picked up a 30-month sentence for escaping electronic monitoring in 2015. But amazingly, despite this most recent arrest, 5 days after being released from prison for burglary, CWB Chicago reports that state authorities have so far not moved to revoke his parole because he was arrested for burglary 5 days after he got out of prison for burglary. No. His defense attorney said Sandoval is, quote, complying with the conditions of living at a halfway house. Judge Charles Beach set bail for Sandoval at just $5,000. He had to post 10% of that to get out of jail, so $500. And he's out and about. And as far as the state of Illinois is concerned, no big deal, no reason to keep Ruben Sandoval behind bars, even though, according to authorities, he has shown a proclivity towards breaking and entering to places where he is not supposed to be. And again, in Illinois, well, guys like Sandoval get off with a slap on the wrist or less. You know, responsible gun owners who possess a 20-round magazine that they lawfully purchased are told that they're now committing a crime, as well as any owners of so-called assault weapons who don't register those firearms with the state of Illinois by January the 1st. Again, state of Illinois cracking down on legal gun owners, while the prolific offenders repeatedly escape consequence for their actions. Now, today's armed citizen story from Las Vegas, Nevada. And Ranjit Singh covered this at Bearing Arms earlier today. The mass shooter that was stopped by an armed citizen in Las Vegas with 0 casualties. Again, a story that did not and will not get a lot of news attention because this mass shooting was stopped before anybody but the intended killer could harm anybody or could shoot anybody. This happened on Friday at the Turnberry Towers. And a building employee apparently stopped this attack. A gunman walked in, fired shots at the front desk on Friday. Man wearing a helmet, had a rifle and other firearms, according to authorities, when he entered the towers on Friday afternoon. One resident told local media that the man fired shots in the area of the front desk, shattering glass. And they said it was an employee of the towers who stopped the attack. The shooter, taken to a nearby hospital, listed in critical condition. Benjamin Teal is a resident of the apartment complex. He said that their valet attendant may have saved his life by telling him to leave, and then moments later, several gunshots were heard. He said, my valet comes out waving his arm, saying there's a guy with a gun, turn around and go the other way. So we go down to the basement, the first level where the valet parking is, and we heard about 6 to 7 or 8 gunshots. He said it was pretty distinguishable to be a gunshot. Twitter user Brianna Diamond said it was a resident, unprovoked, never had issues with anyone here, just went to his car, grabbed a rifle, came back in, shot up the front lobby. Umberto, who works in receiving, is a hero. He shot the armed man and saved so many lives. Nobody was injured other than the shooter. And again, I'd say this was pretty big news at the local level. But really, no coverage of this. Maybe we'll see a little bit today, but no coverage of this from the national media over the weekend. And I think that's indicative, again, of how defensive gun uses are typically covered or not covered in the media. You know, when a mass shooting like this is thwarted, it is a local news story at best. If this guy had carried out his attack without being stopped by an armed citizen, of course, that would have led the cable news networks. That would have been front page news, not only in Las Vegas, Nevada, but all around the country. But when a guy like this is stopped by an armed citizen, the news media averts its gaze, doesn't want to pay attention to this story, doesn't want to cover the good guy with a gun who stopped a mass casualty event. Now, finally, today's good deed of the day, in the right place, at the right time, willing and able to do the right thing. A teenager who helped rescue a couple who were stuck in an overturned vehicle in Weld County, Colorado. They've had a lot of rain out in Colorado. I think the wettest June on record, at least dating back to the 1880s. And over the weekend, a teenager named Logue was flying his drone and just, having fun, looking at his feet, and he saw what he thought was a shadow originally. But then he said, I flew down there, there's a car in the ditch. And I'm like, in a hole? Like, what? So he flew the drone closer to this sinkhole and soon realized that there was an SUV that was upside down in the sinkhole and that there were people inside. Logue said they had 6 inches of room of an air pocket in there for them to breathe, but the rest was water. So Logue immediately called 911, gave him the general area of the sinkhole. Ryan Nuanez, who is Logue's neighbor as well as a firefighter in Denver, was at the 18-year-old's home at the time that the drone came upon the sinkhole. He said, this had the potential for the emergency to get worse because my concern was that water was going to infiltrate that hole and it was going to fill up. So emergency crews got out there from the Brighton Fire Department. They went to work removing the vehicle from the sinkhole. Nuanez said the rescue was a bit unorthodox, but it worked. He said the equipment that any firefighter has to be augmented by heavy equipment to get into something like that. He said what we ended up doing was backing one of our pickup trucks up to the hole, throwing a chain on the pickup truck, and then some tow straps. The Brighton Fire Department pulled it forward, and then Brighton was able to pull them out. The couple inside the Jeep finally rescued. Man who was driving wasn't wearing a seatbelt and was seriously injured. The woman in the passenger seat was wearing a seatbelt. Thankfully, she was unharmed. And again, this 18-year-old in the right place at the right time, willing and able to do the right thing, saving the life of these two strangers. Logue, which had a last name for him, but Logue in Weld County, Colorado, we thank you for your very, very important and life-saving good deed. Now, that is unfortunately about all the time we've got for you on this edition of Bearing Arms Cam & Company. One other news item of note. We did not hear from the Supreme Court today on the case U.S. versus Rahimi. This is the case involving Zaki Rahimi. We talked about this with Stephen Gutowski of the Reload on last week's Cam & Company, a case that the DOJ has actually appealed up to the Supreme Court. Zaki Rahimi, this domestic violence restraining order recipient who possessed a firearm at the time of his arrest. The Fifth Circuit has said that the statute barring gun possession for those subject to a domestic violence restraining order is unconstitutional because there are no historic analogs to this, that this is basically a civil matter, not a criminal matter, and that as serious as domestic violence is, there are other avenues to deprive somebody like Mr. Rahimi of possessing a firearm rather than using an end run around the Constitution. That's what the Fifth Circuit has had to say. The Department of Justice obviously disagrees. They say that Zaki Rahimi is not a law-abiding citizen, therefore he possesses no Second Amendment rights. And this case went to conference last Thursday. I will confess I was a little surprised that the Supreme Court is holding on to this case. that we didn't get a ruling one way or the other. And I'm leaning towards the Supreme Court taking this case, but the orders from last week's conference came out this morning, and Rahimi was not listed as either being accepted or denied. So that means that the Supreme Court is going to keep this case around for at least another week. Now, they're getting towards the end of their term, but they should release more orders next week, at least one more round of orders from conference before they go on recess. So we'll keep our eyes peeled, but so far, again, no word from SCOTUS on the Rahimi case. Next week could be an important week, because if they don't accept the case or deny it, then it likely could be a couple of months before the Supreme Court decides whether or not they're going to take up this case and this issue. And meanwhile, you're going to have a lot of competing court decisions percolating and bubbling around the appellate courts. So this situation could get even more confusing. We could see even more circuit splits develop in the future. We're going to keep our eyes on this story. We'll bring you all the details when they become available. And of course, we're keeping you up to date on all of the news that's important for your right to keep and bear arms at bearingarms.com. I'd encourage you to check out the website throughout the day. Also encourage you to become a VIP member at Bearing Arms. Just go to bearingarms.com/subscribe. Use the promo code GUNRIGHTS, and you can get a significant savings on your VIP discount or on your VIP membership. Is our way of saying thanks for showing your support. We're going to give you exclusive content you won't find anywhere else. News stories and analysis that matter, because your support matters too. And we really, really do appreciate it. So thank you again. Enjoy the rest of your Monday, as good as a Monday can be. Hopefully you stay dry and powered throughout the rest of the day. We'll see you back here tomorrow for 2-8 Tuesday. But until then, be well, be safe, and be free.